We've gotten really, really good at garbage that you can't see. And for a long time, that's what good garbage meant. For people who were working hard on figuring out how to have less garbage to begin with, good garbage is garbage that we're noticing, garbage that we are seeing.
Hello. Welcome to the Good Garbage Podcast. My name is Ved Krishna. My primary reason for existence has been to find ways to leave our wonderful planet cleaner. We will be speaking with material innovators, creators, and propagators to learn from them how we can build for scale and towards a regenerative future. Their stories will help us answer the big question, what is good garbage? I heard about the work Atlantic Packaging is doing towards sustainability by pivoting their own work and encouraging others to grow. And I wanted to understand more. Wes Carter, the owner, and I met earlier this year and spoke briefly. I subsequently listened to a few of his talks and was further intrigued. Caroline DeLoach is the Director of Sustainability at Atlantic, and we have a wide-ranging conversation. Atlantic is clearly committed to change, and it makes a huge difference when larger organizations make this effort, as they have such an extensive network and reach. Atlantic starts with reducing the packaging footprint for its customers and then explores alternative materials as well. Their New Earth project and ventures is working towards investing and scaling various startups and new technologies that will enable more change. Caroline herself is so committed to making a difference, and Atlantic have clearly the right leader in her for this purpose. This conversation will fill you with hope. Enjoy and learn. Hello. I'm delighted today to have Caroline DeLoach, the Director of Sustainability at Atlantic Packaging. And Caroline, you may not know this, but I've been hounding Wes for a while. I meet him in different trade shows and stuff. I said, Wes, when are you going to come on my show? And, he's like, yeah, we'll figure it out. But I'm so happy that he actually got you to come on it because I've been wanting to learn more and more about Atlantic. And of course, I'm deeply intrigued by you now, you the person. And we're going to start right at you being zip-tied to the White House fence. Tell us about that, and then we go backwards and forward.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. And yeah, that history of my little civil disobedience has faded a little bit into the background unless people do a little bit of Googling. But basically, the story was when I was a sophomore in college living in DC, I participated in a nonviolent protest at the White House against the Keystone XL pipeline, in which about 400 college students from across the country basically zip-tied ourselves to the White House fence to garner media attention and staged a die-in basically in front of the White House, again, protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. And, there had been protests against Keystone for several years by the time that happened in 2014. A lot of, very large protests, but this was one where young people were putting themselves on the line and gathered a lot more media attention because we risked and had arrests. And, at the time, what we were looking for was for President Obama to veto the pipeline, which he did in 2015, I believe. So, it was obviously not just because of that protest, but because of years of nonviolent civil disobedience and protests against the pipeline. But I mean, just in terms of my experience, it's the one and only time I've been arrested. But I was zip tied to the White House fence for about 6 hours, which I did not expect to be up there for that long. It's the coldest I have ever been. It began to snow a little bit on that early March day, but I mean, I learned so much from that experience. And one of my favorite parts of that was we were arrested by the U.S. Park Police because the White House is on park property ultimately. And what we did is something called post and forfeit, which is basically you pay your bail and admit more or less that you have done the crime, and you're released. And normally the fine for this is $100, but because there were so many of us, they gave us a group rate, and we only each had to pay $50 for our bail. So I had $50 of cash with me, and submitted that, and was on my merry way.
I didn't know they did discounting for arrests and bails. That's
Yeah.
amazing that you managed to do that. So this is really intriguing, and of course, it shows something about the person you are. Why was it so important for you? Or let's make it more generic. Why are issues like that so important for you that you're going to put yourself on the line and you're going to try and really influence in some way or the other? Tell us more about what is it in your personality that helps you do that?
I mean, I got interested in environmental issues from a really young age. When I was in elementary school, my science teacher, when I was in third or fourth grade, showed us a video about landfills. And I remember being so taken aback that this was how the grown-ups in our lives had chosen to deal with things that we were throwing away. I, like most people, had never, especially most children, had never thought about what happens to things when we throw them away. Where is away? And I was so disturbed by this, and that these systems were clearly so imperfect, and it just felt very unjust to me, especially the more I learned about it. And as I got into middle school and high school, I got really involved in the climate change conversation of it all, which of course had been heating up, so to speak, with the release of An Inconvenient Truth in the late aughts. And it became very clear that the grown-ups in my life didn't have this under control. And there was a lot of discourse about, like, oh, well, you young people are going to fix it, which is a lot of pressure to put on young people, especially someone in like elementary or middle school. Like, it's supposed to be this very hopeful message, but it's really quite a lot of pressure, and quite generationally unjust to just be looking at young people and saying, like, oh, well, you all are going to fix it. But I really took that to heart, and have historically, people who know me will attest to this, put a lot of pressure on myself to solve these issues. And as I got into college, what was so poignant about Keystone XL was not so much that it was this. I mean, yes, it was the massive pipeline infrastructure project, but more than anything, to me and to a lot of other people, I think it represented this fork in the road of, look, we know that climate change is happening, that we need to keep 80+% of the fossil fuels that exist in the ground if we are going to avoid the most catastrophic results of climate change. And if we know this, then why are we building these massive fossil fuel pieces of infrastructure? So it wasn't so much just about Keystone. It was about this knowledge of, like, we know that this is what we have to do. So why are we permitting this project and others going forward? Keystone happened to be the one that galvanized so much support, in part because it was an international project, from Canada to the Gulf, in part because of the impact it was going to have on a lot of indigenous lands. So it had gotten a lot of public attention. It served as a really good foil for this discussion of, why are we doing this? So it wasn't so much that it was just about Keystone, so much as it was this fork in the road. And I think a lot of young people who were involved, especially thanks to organizations like 350.org and Bill McKibben, who had done this really fantastic tour called Do the Math, about how much fossil fuels needed to stay in the ground. It had really galvanized a lot of that support from young people, especially college students, at the beginning of the fossil fuel divestment movement. So it definitely represented this moment in time, and felt like, I'm a student. I have the privilege to go to the White House on a Sunday and zip tie myself to a fence, and I know it's just going to be a misdemeanor. And I will kind of be able to, post and forfeit that $50 of bail and more or less explain, like, this is why I thought this thing was important to be like, yes, it was a risk, but I wasn't putting my body in the line, so to speak, like chaining myself to a pipeline, like I admit that this was all very like symbolic in nature, but it was and still is very important to me.
So a few years have passed since that time, and of course, you've experienced more life. How do you see civil disobedience, activism? Do you still feel that that's really important, or have you had a change of heart, change of mind? Would you still go and, do something like that if, your if the issue calls out to you, or in general, there is a desire that I don't like this and I'm going to do something. Is that younger Caroline still in you, or you've evolved towards a different Caroline?
I absolutely still think it is just as important as I did. If anything, I think it's more important. We've crossed such a Rubicon in terms of political discourse and political polarization, and unfortunately, getting media attention for big issues like this is so much a part of the strategy for getting anything done. And so sometimes risking arrest, as an example, is a really powerful tool for getting that kind of media attention. The thing that I think is different now that I've, like you said, experienced more life is I'm very glad that I did that when I did, because as I mentioned, being a student and having the kind of freedom and autonomy to go do that kind of thing all day on a Sunday is not necessarily time that I have now with, I have a 9-month old. Like, I wouldn't be comfortable right now going and risking arrest, not being 100% sure that I would be home that night. I mean, I had a feeling when I did that in 2014, like I will be home that night, but I wasn't 100% sure. There were no guarantees of any of this. And it was a time of my life that I had a lot of the bandwidth to do that. And that's not to say that you can't do that as a grown up. Like, you absolutely can, but life gets real, and there are certain times of your life where you have a little bit more freedom to do that kind of thing. And I really encourage students in particular to go after those opportunities, not necessarily like just to get arrested, but to get involved with any kind of activism, because you often have a particularly powerful voice. Like, one of the reasons I got so involved with the fossil fuel divestment movement when I was in college was because as students demanding something of our universities, we were, for lack of a better word, the customer of the university. You have power as a student to influence universities to do something when you're a student. So you might as well take advantage of that time. I'm a big fan of the idea of do what you can with what you have where you are. And as a student, you have a lot of power there. You also have a lot of time. When you're an employee somewhere, you have, some leverage to encourage your employer to adopt sustainable practices and work with your customers to do that kind of thing. But the power dynamic is still different. You're an employee, you're not a customer. So you have to figure out where are the places in your life where you are the customer, so to speak, where you have some power to demand better from the powers that be. And when you're a student, you're the customer in a lot of ways of universities, whether we kind of like it or not. So it was a very cool opportunity. And I think people are often looking for what are the young people standing for right now. And, in 2014, that was this like very specific moment in time where a lot of students were demanding action from universities on fossil fuels.
Yeah, just don't tell everybody about the discount you got, that might encourage others to get it.
Yeah,
Oh, it's not really $100, they give you a good rate.
I'm sure inflation has brought it up. Who knows?
No, this is great. So I also saw that you had a very interesting mix of subjects when you were studying, and it was political science, environment, and music. So that's super interesting. And tell us more about that, like your choice of what did you have in mind that this is what I want to do and hence I'm going to study this, or there was nothing in mind and I'm just going to do what I like and figure it out? Was there a thought process that went into that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the truth of the matter was I was really hoping for an environmental studies major. At the time, Georgetown did not have an environmental studies major. They had an environmental biology major. I knew I didn't want to be a biologist, but they had this environmental studies minor. So I had to figure out, well, what am I going to major in? I know I'm going to minor in environmental studies. What am I going to major in? And of course, I'm in DC, I'm at Georgetown. The most popular major at Georgetown is government. And I mean, it was hard at the time not to look around and say, I mean, if I'm going to combine environmental studies with anything, shouldn't it be policy? Shouldn't it be the way that we actually get any of this stuff done? And so the government classes that I took my first year of college were fascinating to me. I had always been interested in politics and policy thanks to my parents who were very politically literate and involved. So it just seemed to me that if I was going to combine environmental studies with anything, that thinking about it through a political science government policy lens made a lot of sense. And then, the music on top of it, people should take advantage of their time in college where they can. I had been a pianist and a singer throughout my childhood and high school, and just really wanted to continue my musical education. So thankfully, I was lucky enough to have enough room in my schedule to also complete a music minor, which just gave me a lot of joy and fulfillment. So it had nothing to do with government or environmental studies, but still something I'm very happy that I did.
Yeah, and it nurtured the artist in you.
That's
It continued to nurture it. So then you joined the big Deloitte, or the little Deloitte. So of course that's an ocean, right? That's like
right.
huge. And we've worked with Deloitte now and then, and they have just so many divisions and so many things happening. And of course, there's political advocacy, but then there is also accounting and, consulting and all of that. So how did that happen? And were there important learnings that came from working with such a large, diverse organization?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I try to be very truthful and forthright about what this journey looked like, because I know, like, I talk to a lot of students who are trying to figure out, what do I do straight out of college. So the truth of the matter was that my senior year of college, I was beginning to think, do I want to look for some environmental policy kinds of jobs? And this was early on in the fall. And as I was looking at jobs in government, everything was hiring for immediate placement, not for placement of, you know, I'm applying in November and I graduate in May. And of course, being the very like type A person that I am, I wanted to figure out, what am I doing after college now? And around November of my senior year, Deloitte and a bunch of other firms, are coming on to big college campuses and looking for their next batch of right out of college hires. I had always been kind of fascinated by the idea of consulting, because I love asking the right questions and working with lots of different people in fast-paced environments. And so I was like genuinely intrigued by the idea of consulting. So I began to go to info sessions and hear the kind of work that they were doing. And the reason I got particularly interested in what Deloitte was doing there was because they hired for what was then just their federal government practice from the schools in DC. And having, studied political science and such, I thought, okay, well, this could be a really nice in between for me, where I get to work in the private sector while my clients are government agencies, and I'll probably learn a lot about government in a short amount of time. Even though I had kind of pictured myself going into government or some kind of political advocacy out of school, here was this opportunity that was presenting itself in like November of my senior year, where I could go ahead and lock something down that did genuinely sound interesting to me. So some of it was genuine interest, and some of it was this desire to go ahead and lock down what I was doing. And the reason that I bring that up is because I find that a lot of students are really anxious to figure out, what am I going to do after college? And a lot of the nonprofit government kinds of jobs aren't hiring until they need someone to join. They're not necessarily looking for, oh, well, this is a job for when you graduate. Whereas a lot of the really big firms have these annual cycles where they're getting ready to bring in their next batch of 100 22-year-olds every year. And that can be really appealing to people who are just graduating from college, to go ahead and have that certainty. And I was definitely one of those people. I accepted a job with the federal consulting practice with Deloitte in the fall of my senior year. My experience there was really fascinating because I was really hoping to get some contracts at places like Department of Energy or EPA, and those were relatively small clients to begin with at the time, but they really dried up when I joined in the fall of 2016, when the administration began to have a lot of politicization of the environmental oriented kinds of agencies. So I wound up at agencies that were not environmentally related, but still learned a ton about the ins and outs of just kind of general government sausage making. So it was really helpful to see, if I want to go into government in the administrative branch, what might that look like day to day? Where is it possible to solve problems and where does it feel really hard? And I mean, I will be completely frank that the political environment of the time while I was at Deloitte, 2016 to 2020, there was a lot of uncertainty about like what is the role of government going to be going forward. So that definitely affected my thinking about where I might want to end up more permanently in my career as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. It must have been quite an upheaval. Probably easier than now, but but still, it just came to me, and I don't know why. So I'm going to ask you this because a friend of mine recently, and I would have never thought she would have said this. And I said, "What do you want to really do in life?" And she's already a bureaucrat, and she says to me, "I want to run for office."
Mm.
Do you want to run for office?
It is so funny you asked that question because I am married to someone who is planning on running for office. I have always pictured myself being appointed to something, not being elected to something. I'm not quite good enough at beating around the bush a little bit. I think to get elected to something, I speak my mind a little bit too much, and I think I'm a little technical in the area that I'm in to run for office, but I would love to be appointed by someone who runs and wins for something to things that are circular economy related. So I'll just put that out there in case anyone is looking for political appointees.
Or tell your husband that, even if it's
Oh, he
nepotism,
knows.
I
Yeah,
want that job.
yeah, he knows.
I'm well qualified. Okay, so you take a turn and you go in for an MBA. So what prompted that? And of course, that probably takes you on a different trajectory than what you had initially planned. So how did that evolve?
Yeah, there were two big things. The first was that at Deloitte, as is the case at lots of consulting firms, you're expected to take on some kind of extracurricular activities in addition to your client work, and that was, at least at the time, very much up to you about where you spent that time. And I decided to spend that time developing a community of practice within the DC offices of Deloitte, trying to improve the sustainability of Deloitte as a firm. And that was obviously a huge undertaking. I mean, a massive firm, many, many things to think about. But as I was working with other folks, especially younger folks who were really interested in how do we improve the sustainability of this business, I found that was my favorite part of my day. And it was something I was probably spending 10% of my time on, but it was easily the time that I looked forward to the most was how am I going to help the firm improve its sustainability? So that was one piece of it where I found myself really enjoying kind of the private sector. How do we improve the sustainability? The other thing that was going on, to my earlier point, was as I'm involved in government as a contractor and as I'm seeing the news and seeing, the US pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, for instance, I'm feeling pessimistic that the US government is going to do at the federal level is going to be doing what is necessary to mitigate the effects of climate change and to develop a circular economy. And I am seeing more and more voluntary commitments from corporations on climate, circular economy, many other issues. So as these things are happening, I'm thinking, well, I feel like I've gotten good at articulating why sustainability is the right thing to do, but I think I need to get a lot better at articulating why sustainability is the smart thing to do from a business perspective. And frankly, I had avoided pretty much all business classes when I was in college. I had this sense of, business and the private sector is the reason we got in this mess. Capitalism is how we got here, which is still true as far as I'm concerned. But I still felt like I needed to be able to get into the belly of the beast to understand how are we going to change this from a business perspective if the government isn't going to do it. So having failed to take pretty much any business classes when I was in college, I thought, okay, I think I might need to go get an MBA to get really good at articulating this. So I had originally thought maybe I wanted to go get a Master of Public Policy and an MPP. But as I got more and more into this idea of, I actually think that maybe the private sector is where a lot of this is going to happen, I decided an MBA was the place to do it.
Yeah, I did spend part of a summer at Yale in New Haven, and I just remember a lot of time in the swimming pool, actually. I used to do a lot of swimming back then, and it was spent in that beautiful pool. So I was doing a program on quantum learning, and it was over the summer,
Cool.
but the first day, of course, that time, I don't know what New Haven is like now, and I'm talking way before. It was like 1995, so long time back, and I remember the police came in the first day to tell us what we can and what we cannot do. Like we
Mm.
cannot go into these areas, we cannot walk at night like this, da 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 da, because so dangerous at that point. I don't know if it's improved, but that's my memory of New Haven and Yale, swimming and the police.
Well, that part's kind of unfortunate. I can't attest to the difference between now and the late '90s or anything. But I had a lovely time in New Haven, and what was so special about the program that I was in and the reason that I chose it was, yes, I wanted an MBA, but I also wanted further education in some more technical environmental areas that I hadn't gotten to focus on in college. And the Yale School of Management program is really special because they allow you to take any number of classes outside of the School of Management and have them count towards your MBA. And this interdisciplinary opportunity and perspective was so important to me. I mean, as you can tell from everything that I've said, I'm an interdisciplinary learner and thinker. I want to be thinking about all of it. And as much as I was just saying that I was very focused on how can business be this force to act on climate and circularity. I still very much believe in the power of government. It's just where are we each going to choose to make that change. But in any case, Yale has what was previously called the Yale School of Forestry, now called the Yale School of the Environment. And I was able to take a bunch of classes there that I counted towards my degree. So I did a lot of focus in a field called industrial ecology, which is basically the field of the circular economy, the science of the circular economy. And that was so helpful to put together with my business education and some of the other classes that I took on regulation. I am so, so grateful for my time at Yale because it really gave me the business basics that I needed to be able to speak about why sustainability is the smart thing to do. And then I got this really fantastic graduate education in some of these environmental topics that I felt I was lacking.
And how did Wes manage to find you? Or
I
how
found
did you
him.
manage to... Exactly. So, either case, because I was also thinking, it's a side note, but when you were talking about, I was joining the two things together. You came into Deloitte thinking, okay, you might work on certain environmental kind of projects, but since you didn't get them, you started working on sustainability within Deloitte. So, clearly you have it in your genes or deep set. So that's such a beautiful thing to have in a person when they are chosen for a role like this. So how did Atlantic come about?
It was so serendipitous. I'm so grateful for how it turned out. But when I was in my first year of grad school and thinking about where do I want to land next? I mean, I had come to business school to make a career shift. I wanted, at Deloitte, about 10% of my job had been sustainability, and I wanted something where at least 75% of my job was sustainability. And I was trying to figure out what would the field or the role look like that would make me feel like I was accomplishing something. And as I was going back to the first topics that had gotten me really interested in the environment. As I mentioned earlier, from my experience in elementary school, it was trash. It was landfills. I really wanted to be focusing on that. And so I started looking at the EPA data of what winds up in landfills, as one does, and saw that there are three big categories of things that we throw away in municipal solid waste. And that's food, textiles, and packaging. And I figured if I can make an impact in one of those, I will feel really good about my career. So I started looking for opportunities in those three fields. I knew that I needed to be in North Carolina for my now husband. And so I literally Googled at one point, sustainable packaging North Carolina, just to see what would happen. And up popped Atlantic. And Atlantic had, from what the digging around that I did on the website, had clearly been like well established as this very technical packaging company focused on packaging optimization. And it was clear that they were taking this packaging optimization that was in their DNA and saying, actually, this has a very real implication for packaging sustainability, which is becoming more important. But they were clearly at the beginning of this journey. But I saw some videos of Wes speaking very passionately about this topic and about the packaging industry's critical role in addressing this problem. And I thought, this is someone I think I want to work for. And I found his email and I cold emailed him and said, hey, I'm an MBA student at Yale. I know this is random, but I'm looking for an internship for between my 2 years of grad school. Would you consider taking on an intern? And I think like 40 minutes later, he replied and said, yes, let's chat. We set up some time and it just was really clearly a good fit. And that first summer that I spent, it was, the timing was just really serendipitous because Atlantic was trying to find its footing in how can we further the sustainable packaging conversation with our areas of expertise? And I could bring in this more technical, well, how do you assess whether something is actually sustainable? How do you assess if it's going to make its way through the recycling stream, or if a composter is actually going to want it? And if it's actually going to work for the purposes that our customers need. And so I got to bring in this sustainability meaning making, for lack of a better word. And so at the end of that summer, I went to Wes and said, hey, I would really love to come back when I graduate. Could I come back as some kind of sustainable innovation analyst or something? I think it would be a really good fit. And he said, can you come back as our director of sustainability? I said, yeah, I would love to do that. That would be my dream job. And he said, can I convince you to skip your last year of grad school and come on right away? And I said, no, you cannot convince me to do that. I'm going to finish this up, but I can't wait to come back. So I really got to land like this dream job, like right out of grad school. The asterisk that I'll put on that for a lot of, potential sustainability job seekers and such is, as I was looking for jobs, my friends were going into banking and tech and working for big CPG companies that we had all heard of. And here I was going to work for this company that none of my friends had ever heard of. And there was something a little bit uncomfortable about that, of like, am I doing something wrong that I'm not going to work for one of these big names that all the other MBAs are going to work at? But I was getting the perfect role. Like the perfect thing for me in the right location with the right culture. And I am so glad that I took the job at the place that nobody had heard of, because the role is so much more important than the name of the company.
Yeah, it's definitely think you also have a contrarian streak in you, so that probably fed that well, right? That okay, I'm going to do my own thing. So come what may. So of course we have a very global audience, and I know Atlantic very well, and I know it's huge, and it's probably one of the biggest privately held packaging companies globally. But tell us more. Give us a talk through an Atlantic and what it does, just so that the audience hears of it, and I learn more about what all are the divisions, what is it doing? Because I know it has a plethora of packaging activities and maybe a little bit of the history as well.
Yeah, sure. So Atlantic is actually an 80-year-old company. It's, as far as we know, the largest privately held packaging company in North America. And as I mentioned before, it's a very technical packaging company in that We specialize in packaging design, optimization, equipment, and processes. So a lot of the packaging that we do is what we would call secondary and tertiary packaging. So the packaging that goes around the primary packaging. So just to back up for people who may not be aware of, the packaging types, we often think of packaging in primary, secondary, and tertiary, sometimes called logistical packaging. And the primary packaging is what's touching the product itself. So let's just say that you have like a bar of soap. If you have like a paper wrapper or a plastic shrink sleeve around the bar of soap, like that's the primary packaging. And then if you have a 2-pack bundle of soap and those are bundled together like in a box, that's secondary packaging. And then if you have a whole case of those, that's like tertiary packaging. And your logistical packaging is like when you put that on a pallet with a bunch of stretch wrap, like the stuff that actually moves it through our economy. So Atlantic, for the most part, focuses on secondary and tertiary packaging. And for the most part, we are actually a distributor, which, in some ways is like a dirty word within the packaging industry, except here's why I bring it up from a sustainability perspective. We source from a huge network of suppliers for all kinds of packaging. And that makes my life very easy as a sustainability professional, because as I'm trying to help our customers look for what is the most sustainable packaging for their purpose, I don't feel compelled to tell them to use a certain kind of packaging because we happen to make it. We can pull from a variety of different suppliers based on what's most sustainable for that customer. So it allows me and us in general to be very impartial about what is the kind of packaging that makes the most sense for this application to be the most sustainable. So in a lot of ways, to call us a distributor is probably not really the right word anymore. We're kind of aggregators and consultants of the right kind of packaging to meet the sustainability and performance needs of what our customers are looking for. So we serve basically every industry vertical that you can think of, from automotive to food to bakery and medical, everything in between. We're primarily based in the Carolinas in the US, but we do have a nationwide US presence. Some of our customers we're helping on a more global level, but pretty US focused. And then we have about 30% of our revenue coming from things that we make. We are one of the largest paperboard converters in North America. So that basically means we do everything to paper that you can do to paper, other than make it. So we're not a paper mill, but we coat paper, we cut paper, we turn it into boxes, we print pretty much anything that you can think of that can be done to paper, we do it. We also have a very huge printing and graphics capability. So we do a little bit of everything that you can do with paper and printing and graphics. And then we aggregate and source a ton of packaging from all kinds of different suppliers. And I would say that one of our differentiators is a focus on packaging optimization. So big focus on helping our customers use the least amount of packaging that they can to accomplish the goal that they need. And, this is kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people, because as a packaging company, you think your goal is just to sell as much packaging as possible. Your incentives aren't necessarily aligned with helping customers use less. And I'm happy to go into this if this is helpful, but we've figured out ways to incentivize ourselves to use the least amount of packaging possible to sell to our customers. Then over the last 3 or 4 years, we've gotten really involved in a lot of alternative materials to your traditional paper and plastic options. So plastic replacements made out of things like seaweed or chitin, upcycled food waste. So we've gotten really involved in the next generation of nature-based functional packaging materials, and we can go into that as well.
Oh yeah, we'll go into all of those. That's why we are here. But like I say, the best packaging is actually no packaging. But
Yeah.
of course, we need to protect stuff. So if you were to just digging a little deeper on what Atlantic does, so if you were to divide it in divisions or product verticals, so 30% you said is paper-based kind of manufacturing, if I can call it that, or printing and boxes. But do you guys do corrugated cartons as well
Yeah.
and things like that? And that's
Mhm.
part of the same paper
Yep.
kind of division. How is the division? Say if it's 30% paper, what is the rest? What is the 70%? Or does it
The
fall
other
into one
70,
division, trading, and that's it?
yeah, that other 70% is really just all distribution.
Okay.
So everything that we don't make ourselves.
And it could be any of it, right? It could be a polymer-based product, and it could be, and would they be divided in different segments, or would that be bunched together?
I mean, it's bunched together for the sake of thinking of our overall revenue, but I think
Yeah.
probably the easiest way to divide it within that 70% is just by industry and application. So our folks who service protein customers who are wrapping raw chicken, really different kind of packaging, very different specifications than our folks who do e-commerce, where you're doing air pillows, bubble wrap replacements, things like that. So I think the easiest way to think about it is in terms of different industries and the applications and performance requirements for each of those.
That's actually, I know you've just said it like this is what it is, but it's actually fascinating
Right.
that a company divides its focus by the customer rather than by the substrate. Because I find a lot of people, a lot of packaging companies might divide it by, okay, this is our division for paper, this is our division for certain kind of polymers, this is our division for seaweed or whatever. But it's a very product centric approach then. What you're talking about is a very customer centric approach. Okay, what does the meat packaging need? Okay, it might need a certain kind of film, it might need a certain kind of tray. So that's what goes into the meat division then, which is fascinating. And is that, I presume that's by design? Would you know how did that come about, or was it always very customer led?
I think it was always very customer led, but began to make sense just based on the performance requirements, because we would have folks who were well versed in certain industries. Maybe they came from protein or fresh produce or aviation or whatever, and they had a sense of the kinds of packaging that were required for those purposes. But I mean, you really can't divide this by substrate. You have to think of it by application, because I mean, let's just say you have like your paper folks and you're trying to figure out how to service your customers who are in e-commerce, who are maybe using a paper-based cushioning in Amazon packages. If you want to use paper then to wrap raw chicken, it's not going to accomplish the same thing. I mean, we just have dramatically different needs for paper that's doing different kinds of things. Same thing with plastic, very, very different requirements. I mean, a lot of people don't have an appreciation for just the huge diversity of particularly plastic materials and all of the different things that they have to do. And now, I mean, there's a lot of diversity within paper materials too, but each of these customer bases, it's really very similar to my time in consulting, in that each of my customers is so different. And a lot of what I love about this job is getting to learn about the different industries and the applications where packaging has very different needs, because I can't use the same packaging that I do in e-commerce for protein. I just can't. So we have to think in a very customer centric, application centric way about the kinds of packaging that we're using.
But trust me, Caroline, the industry does go by substrates, and it's interesting that we are talking about this, because I like when I jumped on the call, I said, "Oh, I was giving a talk," and I just rushed in, and I was giving a talk to the Federation of Paper Traders in India, and it was 600 people. These are all paper traders of India. And my whole talk was basically aligned on this, that what is paper? So ultimately paper is a substrate. Don't get so obsessed about paper. Paper does one of three things, I said, and that's it. It either is used for communication, and that could be anything in printing, writing, whatever, advertisement. And then there is hygiene, and that could be anything in the tissues and diapers and napkins and what have you. And then there is packaging, right? Those are the three divisions that those are the three usages that paper has. And if we start thinking of ourselves as merely paper providers, you're actually getting into the same syndrome as a typewriter provider and a fax provider and a telephone, dial phones to providers. You will get defunct because you're not understanding what the customer really needs. But that's the way the whole industry functions. So I'm so impressed that Atlantic figured this out, because it actually changes everything. the way you work, the mindset, the kind of people you hire, the way you serve, the thought process of solutionizing. It's actually a very smart way to do it. And I'm going to congratulate Wes separately on that. I didn't know this bit. So great. Good on you guys to do that. And of course, I want to, and you can, of course, comment on that more if you want, but I'm just going to step into what I really want to talk about. And I know you are the right person to talk to that about the whole idea of the New Earth project. And of course, I know that Wes had a certain awakening, and he decided that he's going to really work on this, and he has. So tell us more about that whole idea and how you guys are planning to build it.
Sure. So, a New Earth project was born kind of out of an experience that Wes had of learning that the top plastic polluters in the world were mostly our customers. Looking at a lot of the CPG companies, especially with like food and beverage packaging that winds up in our oceans, lakes, and rivers, and thinking, wow, if we sit in the middle of the packaging supply chain and we're the ones who are supplying a lot of this packaging to our customers, we have not only a role, but a responsibility in figuring out how to advise our customers and move them away from the most harmful single-use plastics that wind up in our environment. And he is also an avid surfer and outdoorsman and has seen firsthand a lot of the garbage that winds up in Earth's most beautiful places. He began talking to a lot of outdoor athletes and professional outdoor athletes who were seeing this same thing and saying, I mean, I know that this feels very far away from professional skiing or surfing or what have you, but single-use packaging is a really big threat to outdoor athleticism and the enjoyment of the outdoors generally. And so he was trying to figure out, how can we use professional outdoor athletes to raise awareness of these problems and then to integrate those efforts with the packaging supply chain and a lot of the biggest companies in the world to address plastic pollution in our Earth's waters. So a New Earth project began with an effort to use the outdoor industry as kind of a series of pilots to move away from single-use packaging towards curbside recyclable or compostable packaging solutions that we could tell stories about. So we began to work, for example, with surf companies who were moving away from using lots of shrink wrap and tape and bubble wrap to package their surfboards, and trying to figure out how could we use completely curbside recyclable or reusable materials to package and ship these items, and then tell stories about how we did that and why consumers like them better. And of course, the way that we can think about moving away from single-use plastics for a surfboard can tell us a lot of lessons about how to move away from single-use plastics for packaging a cabinet or a washing machine. Those stories are not quite as fun to tell with the washing machine or the cabinets, which is why using surfboards or skis can be such a powerful storytelling tool. We could have these outdoor advocates show like, oh, look how cool this packaging is, and I don't have to throw any of this stuff away. I can recycle it instead. And so we've really used, in the first few years, have used a New Earth project to highlight the outdoor industry and how we can make those shifts and the lessons that they can tell us about industry-wide changes that we can make in the packaging supply chain. Over the last couple of years, a New Earth project has evolved to include a catalog of New Earth approved products. We have a series of kind of aspirational North Stars that we're looking for in terms of the packaging that we prefer to put on the market where we can and to help match our customers with. So it's become this galvanizing force for storytelling around making packaging switches, around highlighting a lot of the voices of professional outdoor athletes who are trying to show that single-use plastic poses a big threat to their sport and of course to the Earth's waterways, and then to involve brands from across industries in telling success stories about how they have made switches away from single-use plastic towards either recyclable materials or towards a next generation of alternatives to traditional plastic.
And does it kind of tag team with your whole idea of reducing the amount of packaging as well? Or is this is a totally different kind of take on packaging?
No, I mean, completely aligned. So, I mean, the first and foremost thing that we always want to do is figure out how to help customers use less packaging. I mean, the surfboard is a really good example because we did need to move the surfboards into a corrugated cardboard kind of protective packaging material to float the surfboard within the box. But pound for pound, we're using much less material than we did when it was covered in bubble wrap and tape, etc. The idea is of always to use as little as possible, and then where we do need to use packaging, to figure out where to use curbside recyclable or compostable materials. But optimization and design for less is always first principle.
Do you have any matrix for measurement? Like, how do you holistically measure that, we've reduced this much packaging? Because obviously, as a company, you would want to keep growing, but per customer or per piece, you want to reduce the amount of packaging. So how do you, like, if you're sitting in a boardroom, how do you decide that, okay, am I doing justice to my goal of reducing packaging while I'm also wanting to grow the company? So how do you have a matrix for measuring that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because as I was alluding to before, you would think as a packaging company, your goal is just to sell as much packaging as possible. So how do you align your incentives to use less? So there are a couple of ways in which you can do that. I would say that one of the first ones is this is not a zero sum game where we only have, X amount of business with a company and we need to switch all of their packaging from plastic to paper, but we need to use just as much material so that we make just as much money. Let's use less material and make less money on the applications that they're using today and create trust with the customer so that they say, oh, you're actually helping us use less material and spend less money on it. Hey, can you help us do packaging for this other item too? And so we grow new business in applications that we weren't having before. So we're still growing in that we're getting more business within each customer. So that's part of it is getting just new business on top of what we're already doing by creating trust that our goal is always to use the least amount of packaging possible and to help save our customers money. I mean, that's such a huge part of it, right? Like if we can save our customers money, like all of us are going to be happy and then they want to do more business with us. So that's probably piece number one. Piece number two is a lot of times where we're using less material or a different material, the margin is often higher on those new sustainable materials. So we're ultimately using less of it. The customer's ultimately spending less money in total on their packaging, but we might be selling a higher margin product or a higher performance product. We would rather sell better, higher performing products than lower performance commodity products. And so they win and we win. The other piece that I think is important to mention here is we're always thinking about packaging in the sense of total cost of ownership. So it isn't just about pound for pound the amount of material that a customer is using. You have to think about all of the other implications of your packaging on labor, on freight, on consumer experience. So again, just to go back to the surfboard example where by the way, they were using substantially less material when they moved from plastic to paper, but the cost was approximately the same for the new paper material that they were using. However, where we did wind up saving the surf companies money was in the cost to pack the surfboard. So the new paper-based system was so much more efficient to pack that they brought their time to pack a surfboard down from 20 minutes to 3 minutes. And a lot of the surfboard companies were so excited about the labor that they were saving there that it was well worth the trouble of making the switch, even though the material savings, the cost for material savings was actually not that high. Like the labor savings were quite high. We have other situations in in which the reduction in packaging allows companies to put more on any given truck. And so they bring down their freight costs. I mean, this isn't just about the cost of materials, it's about thinking about the total cost of ownership of packaging. Now, extended producer responsibility fees are becoming a bigger part of that in terms of thinking about it isn't just the cost of the material, it's the fees that I'll be paying in various states on the materials that I'm using. So it can't just be about the cost of the material. It has to be about labor, about freight, about EPR fees, and we find creative ways to make sure that we're aligning our incentives with helping our customers use the least amount possible.
So I get the theory, and I'm going to push you a little bit for my education, right? So what happens in business, Caroline, is ultimately you need something to measure whether
Mhm.
you are meeting your goals or aims or whatever you've set out to meet. So what I find here is there's a dichotomy because you want to grow as a company because you're a business and like that's what your shareholders would want, right? Growth. But what you're doing is very noble that you're cutting down on the amount of packaging, which exactly what you're saying. There's going to be more customer stickiness for you. There is going to be more customers who will get attracted to you. But what I'm trying to understand, if there is, and you can totally shut me down and say, wait, we don't have a real number for it. But if there is, how would you measure your performance at the end of the year or end of the quarter? That guys, we reduced this much packaging and we increased this much revenue, right?
Mhm.
Because then you're kind of assessing the business angle of or the business sense of that as well, that I'm meeting my aim in reducing. Because in theory I understand it, the spirit is great, we want to do this and I'm totally aligned with you in spirit. But how would you get to, okay, I'm reducing this much and yet increasing this much business? Is there a measure for it? At the end of the quarter, do you say this much packaging per piece? So, for example, when we are producing, like our company produces, say, paper, we would typically measure contribution per hour, right? This is the amount of contribution that this machine makes per hour based on the certain sales price, certain tonnage, certain da 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 da. And that's the one figure that governs us. But it's based on what we are trying to do, right? So again, does Atlantic have that kind of measure which kind of doesn't contradict each other?
Mhm. Yeah, it's such a good question. And the honest answer is no, we don't have that metric right now. It is something that I would love to see in the future because if we could prove out that, hey, we see this amount of revenue increase with this amount of material decrease, like that would be super cool. And maybe we could get other packaging companies aligned on this as well. I think that that's probably the next frontier. As you know, I mean, measuring this stuff is really hard. Like with thousands of customers, I think what we would need to be doing is asking each of our salesmen to help capture, what are the material savings that you've helped this customer achieve this year, and then what have been your sales increases that you can attribute to that. Of course, like that attribution in itself is hard, so it would be, a really big but I think very worthwhile effort to try to figure that out. We haven't gone down that road yet, but I think that it would be very worthwhile.
And if someone could do it, it would be Atlantic. You know why? No, there is a reason for it, and that's from our earlier conversation, because you're application led, right? So
Hmm.
it tags team, right? So say if you're so application led that this is my division for white good packaging, the TVs and the fridges, etc. So that's my division. So you're so application led. So I'm sure there is somebody who figures out on a typical TV what is the amount of packaging that it takes, and then what did we reduce, and the revenue from that segment is obviously you already have that bit. So I think if someone could do it, it would be Atlantic because you are application led. And that's why I've said earlier, it's really wise the way you've structured the business itself. So good luck on that. I hope you do it. And then in the future, call me, tell me, like we figured this out
Yeah.
because this is great. And most likely this is going to be the case. You would have reduced the packaging and increased your revenue.
Yes.
Because the stickiness, the customer centricity would be so much higher, and you would have had a positive social and sustainable impact. So all three are great, right? So that would
Mhm.
be, I would love to get that figure if you guys figure it out that okay, this is how we did it.
Yeah, and I think EPR will have a very positive momentum in helping to generate those numbers because, frankly, what I'm seeing industry wide, and I'd be curious if you're seeing something similar, the data quality is just so poor industry wide about the amount of packaging that's used for any given application. And now companies are being forced to calculate it. And we're going to have more data industry wide about what is the average amount of packaging that it takes to pack a TV. And so if we can all collectively be getting that and then be aiming for reduction because we're all trying to save money on that material, then I think we'll have an easier time starting to generate that number about where did we achieve material savings, and then by the way, where did we see increased revenue.
Yeah, your sustainability report would be a lot hard hitting, like when you actually come out with those numbers. But
Yeah.
that said, there is awareness. Like when I meet customers, they know the amount of packaging they're using. If not in the amount of pounds or tons, they know. Well, they also know that, but they also maybe they don't know per piece, but they definitely know this is the percentage of revenue that goes into packaging,
Mm.
right? And then they can pretty much figure out, like if you talk to them, they would have figured out if there is a particular customer who you reduce the amount of packaging for, they would have seen it immediately because it would have been okay, this is the amount of dollars they were spending on packaging, and this was the percentage of revenue that was going into packaging, and it's come down. It would be pretty evident to them. So they might know, and if you ask them, they may or may not tell you. So that's the challenge. Depends on your relationship with them because they don't want to tell you that, we've really reduced our packaging, even though you know and they know, and so that's
Sure.
that's the industry dynamic.
Yeah.
We would like to take a minute to thank our sponsors. Good Garbage is sponsored by Paka, a family of brands that produces compostable packaging and works to implement regenerative solutions. Paka's new project is to bring compostable food serviceware and food carry products to the North American marketplace. Learn more at paka.com. Now back to the conversation. All right, I'm going to pivot and go back to New Earth, but one of the other interesting things that you've done is the New Earth Ventures. So, and then you were talking a little bit, you're inferring to it a little bit on new products that you are investing in. So I would love to know more about that, and also from a standpoint of the listeners, because a lot of the listeners come from the early sustainable packaging kind of businesses and people who are interested in sustainability. So even you can give a shout out as well that, guys, if you're doing something interesting, reach out. So what is it all about? How did it come? What are you trying to achieve?
We have a lot of great sustainable packaging technologies out there today that are recyclable or compostable, but as a lot of people who listen to this podcast are probably aware, we're also seeing a renaissance of new packaging innovations, particularly to replace traditional petroleum based single use plastics made out of pretty much any material that you can think of. There's someone trying to make some kind of packaging material out of it. And it used to be, that you had a handful of big companies like the 3Ms of the world or whoever who made packaging. And now it's so exciting because we're seeing all of these startups who are trying to create new packaging substrates. And it's very exciting when we read these headlines saying like blah 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 company is making packaging out of wherever, out of whatever. But then of course the rubber hits the road of how do these companies figure out what kind of applications they should be making? How do they get connected to the right kinds of customers to pilot this stuff with, and then how do they get the money to actually do that and avoid, the valley of death that a lot of sustainable innovations or any innovations wind up in. So this conversation kind of started because we met the folks at Cruise Foam who were making an alternative to expanded polystyrene, brand name Styrofoam for those who don't live in the polymer world all day. They were making a replacement for styrofoam that was compostable. And we were trying to figure out, okay, how do we help this company get to the right customers and scale? And at first, this was a few years ago, we thought, well, maybe the thing for us to do is basically to be their exclusive go-to-market partner. Like we should be their distributor. And so we started this agreement where we were partnering with them on cold chain shipping systems for meal kits, pharmaceuticals, things like that. And what we found, very frankly, was that while there were customers that we could match them with, like just some of those applications were not our area of expertise. And we needed to figure out other ways that we could help them get to scale without being their only distributor. So we thought, okay, well, maybe being their exclusive distributor is not the way to do this. Maybe what they need is an investment from us. They need investment and they need technical know-how. And so maybe we can provide that without this kind of exclusivity. Maybe we want other people to be selling cruise foam if we actually want it to be proliferating in the market. So that kind of turned into this idea of, have we accidentally just started like a corporate venture arm where we are investing in these technologies, not just with money, but with sweat equity and technical know-how, with our 80 years and 2,000 employees worth of technical know-how and engineering, where maybe we can help find these companies that are making the next generation of sustainable materials and help match them with the right customers. And we can take, an equity stake or provide other kinds of financing in exchange. So over the last couple of years, we've kind of soft launched and will soon be hard launching this corporate venture arm called New Earth Ventures, where we are looking for those next generation of materials, but also other technologies like software or MRF sortation technologies that are helping to scale the circular economy. And maybe we can lend our technical ability to help get them to scale. A lot of that has to do with figuring out what the right customers and applications are. When we hear about these new packaging types, they often don't have the scale, the production capabilities to go live with a Procter and Gamble or someone on a massive product line to begin with. It wouldn't be fair to expect them to. So how do we figure out which brand it makes sense to do smaller scale pilots with, to keep developing the material so that we can eventually get them to working with a Procter and Gamble or a Unilever or whoever. So we're trying to be this incubator, for lack of a better word, to get these new materials to market. So what I will say, thanks to your invitation, is if anyone out there is developing what they think is the next generation of sustainable materials, particularly those that are recyclable or compostable or reusable, please find us. We want to hear about it. We want to figure out which ones we can be the most helpful with getting to market that have the most sustainability promise. So right now, our investments include Cruise Foam, which I mentioned, Sway, which is a material innovation company making flexible films made with seaweed, and then a software company called SpecRate, which is helping to improve the packaging specs for all kinds of customers, and will also have a really big EPR reporting benefit. So we're looking for those material innovations for sure, but also if there are pieces of software or, as I mentioned, waste diversion or sortation technologies, like we're interested in those as well. So please find us, and you'll start to see more from New Earth Ventures coming up this fall.
Like Caroline, this is huge. Like the I can tell you because I get to meet a lot of through this show as well and other platforms. I meet a lot of younger companies and younger people. I typically even reserve a day a week when if somebody wants to talk, just talk and see what we can do. And all the three things that you mentioned are the stumbling block: getting to market, getting the right amount of money, and scaling or technology. Those are the three pockets that people talk about. And like you said, it's the valley of death is somewhere with one of these that, that they run out of money or they cannot scale or don't know how to reach a customer. So I think this is huge because Atlantic, of course, understands the market space so much more. They know what will work, what will not work. So that guidance coming, that kind of support system being there is huge for these organizations. So like I'm sure many organizations will thank you for this. But I want to thank you as well for thank you and Wes and whoever else is involved in this part. And it is going to benefit Atlantic as well because you are going to come out with better products and you're going to have the first right of refusal and what have you. And this is how you kind of change the world one piece at a time, or one package at a time in our case, right? So you try and create that. So of course you mentioned two people, and of course I don't know the software company, but of course I know John and Julia really really well, and they've been on the show as well, and we hang out and we meet from time to time. I'm glad John gave you time because I keep teasing him. You'll only give us time when you have time from Leonardo and Ashton. So so but he's a great guy, and I'm glad that you guys are working with them. Are you also seeing the shift in customer attitudes? How are you seeing that? Because I've seen it go both ways, right? Because in general, till the current kind of scenario didn't emerge politically, there was more of a shift that was happening. And then now I see a little bit of resistance or a delay in the attitudes. So how are you seeing things holistically? And are you buoyant? Are you a little bit disturbed? Where are you on that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting moment in time because you're right. We're seeing a little bit of backsliding on voluntary commitments and investments in new packaging types. I think on the voluntary commitment side, I think what happened was there was so much energy in the late 2010s around pressuring brands away from the most problematic single-use plastics, and a lot of big beverage CPG companies, et cetera, made these huge commitments for 2025 or 2030 goals of how much plastic they were going to reduce and the recyclability of the things that they were going to use, et cetera. And I think what has become so clear, for better or for worse, is how dependent the brands are on the rest of the infrastructure that exists, particularly for recycling. So I think such a good example is the Colgate toothpaste tube debacle, where Colgate said, we are going to develop a toothpaste tube that is recyclable because it's just made out of number 2 high density polyethylene plastic. And so you'll be able to recycle it in your curbside bin. And they went through the trouble of developing that toothpaste tube that is technically recyclable. That is to say, if it were to get separated with other number 2 plastics, it could be recycled with those. The issue was sortation. When a recycling sortation facility, we call them MRFs in the industry, material recovery facilities, when they receive these toothpaste tubes, they're used to these things not being recyclable. They don't get sorted properly with other number 2 plastics. And also, a lot of other companies are not making toothpaste tubes that are designed for recyclability. And we can't expect people who are at MRFs to be looking and seeing, is this a Colgate tube or is this somebody else's tube? Like, that is simply not going to happen. So without all of the toothpaste companies getting together and saying, we're all going to make monomaterial number 2 HDPE toothpaste tubes, and we're going to figure out how to make sure that the MRFs nationwide figure out how to get these sorted, they're not actually going to be recyclable. And so Colgate got sued, basically saying that their toothpaste tube was recyclable when they couldn't actually prove out that it could be and would be recycled. And this is such an important example, I think. And I really applaud Colgate for all of the work that they have done to try to solve this issue, because I think they did everything that they could figure out how to do for the design of their package. And that's what they had control over. But figuring out how to get all the other toothpaste companies to make theirs out of the same thing and figure out how to get this thing sorted, that's pretty out of their hands. That's not to say that they can't have an influence. They should absolutely try. And I think that they are trying. But I mean, traditionally, that's out of a business's scope to figure out how to do. And it's pretty counterintuitive to say, hey, you as a company need to figure out how to get your competitors to do the good thing that you're doing. Normally, that's, purely from a business perspective, that's not something that we expect businesses to have to do. So I use this as an example because companies like Colgate made big commitments for saying, here's how much of our packaging will be recyclable by 2025. They undertook these massive investments to figure out how to do it, only to get in trouble, more or less, for doing it. Yeah, there have been some successes, like, don't get me wrong, but I think this has been a lot harder than anybody originally thought because we're so reliant on the infrastructure. The example I bring up over and over is it's very similar to saying, like, we're going to get this number of electric cars on the road by whatever year. We're super dependent on the availability of charging stations if we're actually going to do that, because consumers are facing range anxiety, I think is the word that we use for it now. Like, they don't want to buy electric cars if they don't feel like the charging infrastructure exists. So very, very similar idea here. So I think we've seen a lot of backtracking on the voluntary commitments because it just wound up being a lot harder than a lot of the companies thought that it was going to be. When I talk to companies, I hear a lot of the desire to move towards more sustainable packaging still there. I just hear a lot more hesitation now that there's more understanding of what it takes supply chain wide to actually get to recyclability or compostability or what have you, and seeing how reliant we all are on each other and on the rest of the supply chain to actually accomplish the end of life that we want to see for packaging. I don't know if that means that we're going to see a new wave of voluntary commitments over the next few years that are maybe a little bit more tempered based on what companies actually have the power to do versus what they don't. But I think they'll probably just be continuing to quietly work in the background without hamstringing themselves by saying, hey, here's what our goal is. And, oh, by the way, we didn't meet it.
And it is complex, right? And like you're exactly what you're saying, you do try to do something good and get into trouble for trying to do something good, and that doesn't encourage you that much. And not just in terms of the MRFs, it's also complex because there's trillions of dollars invested in the supply chain pre-packaging. I mean,
Yeah.
like you can think about Atlantic's own supply chain. There is a certain way the polymers have run for the last 30, 40 years, and there's a certain coating process that they use. The machines are optimized for
Right.
that polymer. And now if you're trying to run even a seaweed on it or a paper-based product on it, paper-based coatings on it, you're going to have to go through a certain amount of modifications or at least adjustments. And that also must be a challenge, right? Like like people, the converters would not want downtime at their dime or on their cost. So how do you deal with challenges like that? Because there's a whole supply chain setup. You can't just disrupt that. You can disrupt the material. So the material has to be designed for the current supply chain and not for its own optimal morphology, that it has to follow. So how do you come around, getting the right material? Well, it kind of inhibits you in a way towards the material as well, right?
Yeah, it's such an important point because I hear consumers ask all the time, well, why can't we just make packaging out of blah, 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 or why can't they just do blah, blah, blah? And so much of it has to do with the equipment, right? And this was something I had no appreciation for before I was at Atlantic, but the equipment used to apply the packaging to the product is so carefully engineered and so optimized to run at specific speeds and to avoid damage. And a lot of times what we're trying to figure out isn't so much like, can you package X using Y? It's, can you package X using Y on the machinery that has been used for years? How do you retrofit existing machinery so that it can run this new material? Even moving from, a plastic overwrap for something to a paper overwrap for something. I mean, the machinery that applies plastic to something could easily break paper if you were trying to use paper for it instead. So it isn't just about material science. It's also about all of this equipment. And then to your point as well, you also have the MRF of it all, where you're trying to optimize for existing MRF equipment. And one of the examples that drives me crazy is we have a lot of opportunities to move from small plastic packaging to paper. And the paper is recyclable technically in the sense that if we got it separated with paper, it would be recycled. But right now it's really, really small, and small format stuff doesn't run through MRFs very well. We often lose it. It just gets landfilled. So if we're moving to a paper format that's smaller than 2 inches by 2 inches in two or more dimensions, we're not going to actually see it recycled. And there's this perverse incentive that's created sometimes to create paper formats that are larger than they need to be so that they will actually get sorted and recycled at MRFs. And reasonable people can disagree about whether that's worth doing in order to get the paper recycled. Like, should you use more material just to make sure that it gets recycled as opposed to using less, but seeing it wind up in landfill? So we have these realities at MRFs right now, things like the small format issue. Most things that are smaller than an index card are simply not going to be recycled. So we're dealing with like the current situation of MRFs while hoping that we can throw some money at MRFs to improve their technology to do things like sort resin types that we don't normally sort or deal with small format. By the way, I would be remiss not to mention the Circle Act, which has been introduced in Congress. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation to give a 30% investment tax credit for recycling equipment, because as we know, like so much of this improvement requires CapEx to do. And so we want to see better and more recycling equipment out there. So why don't we create an investment tax credit for recycling equipment, just like we have for wind and solar over the last however many years? So there are mechanisms that are out there that could help improve some of this equipment and machinery. I think the Circle Act could be a really cool way to incentivize that. But all of this is to say, you're right. This is a problem. We have to optimize for the equipment and the infrastructure that we have while also potentially designing for a future state in which it improves.
Yeah, I just hope all of us keep taking one step and then hopefully it all comes together at some point. So what about just taking a cue from what you were saying? What about how involved do you need to be on the policy side? Are you actively involved on that side, or that's a different group? How important is that for Atlantic?
It's critical. A huge part of our sustainability team's role is policy because it's moving so quickly. So a couple times in this conversation, you've heard me mention extended producer responsibility laws for packaging in the US. These are laws that we now have in 7 US states that more or less prompt brands to pay fees based on the amount and type of packaging that they're using. And so this is creating huge new incentives to use less and different packaging for our customers. There are new or additional incentives to be using recyclable or compostable packaging. And I'm a big proponent of intelligent EPR. I think that this represents a really cool, like market-based way to move towards more sustainable materials. But of course, when the rubber hits the road on all of this stuff, like the devil is in the details of these regulations within each one of these laws. And we've been really involved, particularly in California's EPR law. Wes sits on the advisory board for that EPR law, which is colloquially known as SB 54. And so we have been neck deep in those draft regulations for several years now. It's really important that we design these laws to do what they were meant to do, to actually incentivize reduction and incentivize the right moves to recyclable or compostable materials. And, there are a lot of places where these laws across the 7 states are not harmonized with each other. And we're going to create quite a headache for the brands if we can't figure out. I'm not saying that they have to all be exactly the same, but I think harmonize is a good word because they're at least going to rhyme with each other a little bit in different places. So we're trying to be very involved in the details in places like California, but also looking at the big picture of where are we going to see future EPR laws and how do we want to help influence them to actually accomplish what they're supposed to accomplish, avoid unnecessary loopholes, avoid unnecessary administrative burdens, and avoid unintended consequences. So the short answer is we have been very, very involved. I'm very excited that it's as big a big part of my job as it has been, given that, as you know, I studied policy. And so really, I'm finally getting to do this thing that I really wanted to do. It's interesting that it's all happening at the state level. Very little of this, aside from the Circle Act that I just mentioned, which is proposed legislation, is happening at the federal level. So much of this momentum is state.
Oh, that's great to hear. So just taking our conversation towards closure, final 3. So if you look at the whole gamut of things that Atlantic works with in terms of materials, how much of a shift do you see maybe in the next 5 years from the materials you use now towards more sustainable materials? Because Of course, you're trying to reduce the amount of packaging, but you have to rely on numerous polymers right now. But with the kind of work you guys are doing, I'm sure there is some thinking around even moving the materials. So say just arbitrary numbers. So if say your total amount of packaging was 50% petroleum polymers right now, what would you say would be an ideal state in the next 5 years or so?
Very interesting question. So I don't know off the top of my head what percent of our packaging is petroleum based polymers at this point, but within the next 5 years, I would love to see, like, for the amount of packaging we're doing right now that is plastics. I would love to see in the next 5 years that we were getting 25% of it to nature based functional materials. I know that probably sounds like a small number, but it's important to remember that traditional petroleum based plastics have had like 70 years to get to the point that we have them today, and $1 trillion or more in innovation and investment. And we're asking for a huge amount of change and momentum for these new materials in a very short amount of time. So, I'm trying to be ambitious, but also realistic about what we might see. But I mean, if we could get to 25% away from these petroleum based plastics, I would be really excited in the next 5 years.
Oh, believe me, you're being ambitious. I'm from the industry. It's tough. And for the listeners, why I say that is because they probably don't know Atlantic's size, right? You are huge. So when you are that huge and you have to take care of your customers' interest. And what I find what is really important is the dharma of packaging, as I call it. The dharma of packaging is to protect what is inside. You cannot compromise on that. Everything else is after that, because if you don't do that primary job and the product that is inside gets impacted or spoiled, then there is a bigger damage even ecologically. So we must remember that. And I think in terms of Atlantic size, if you were able to cut down by 25%, that's a pretty big number. It's not going to be a small number. So good on you to be able to take that. And I hope that with you there and with Wes's kind of spirit and desire and energy, it is going to happen. I actually can see it happening. So that's a pretty big shift. And coupling that with my next question, what would be a desire, like especially when you're looking at your New Earth ventures, and you're trying to help them scale, what would be a desired state, maybe in terms of any number you want to choose? It could be tons or revenue or whatever, and it's a dream, right? I'm not going to hold you to it. So say in the next 10 years this time instead of 5, what is going to be your dream that, these companies together, and maybe there are 100 more that you invest in, we're going to together produce this much revenue or this many tons in the next 10 years of these new age materials?
Oh, that's a hard one. I mean, I think it would be really cool to see the new materials represent 40% of Atlantic's revenue in 10 years. It's definitely really ambitious. As I mentioned earlier, what I'm a little bit hopeful about is that some of these new materials can be high margin products for the packaging industry. So maybe they could represent, a higher proportion of revenue. But I mean, that would be really cool if in 10 years they represented 40% of our revenue.
That is a cool number. I like it because thinking that even if you were growing 10% every year, you would have grown almost over 5x in size in the next 10 years. And then if it's 40%, we're going to give each other a high five,
Yeah.
in 10 years when we meet. If you do that, and even if you do 30, we'll still give each other a high five. That's pretty big in new materials. That gets me, I can feel my excitement. So that's great. Good answer. Okay, my final question. What does good garbage mean to you?
I've thought a lot about this question because it's really hard. I think what I keep coming back to is that for a long time in human history, good garbage meant garbage you couldn't see. It meant let's figure out how to keep our societies as hygienic and clean as possible by getting garbage out of the way and away from potential threats to the environment and to human health. And in a lot of ways, we've come really, really far in that sense. Like I am still convinced that like the underpinning of a functioning society is like good trash collection. Like when you see trash collection stop, people get really, really upset. Things go downhill very quickly. You see disease rise. It's a huge problem. We've gotten really, really good at garbage that you can't see. And for a long time, that's what good garbage meant. And I want to turn that on its head a little bit and say that for our purposes, for people who are working hard on figuring out how to have less garbage to begin with, good garbage is garbage that we're noticing, garbage that we are seeing. And I think COVID had a really big impact there for a lot of us, where we were seeing more of the trash that we were creating, in part because it was arriving at our doorsteps. Like we were ordering a lot of stuff. And so we were seeing a lot of that packaging waste as a result. But I generally think that particularly since like 2017, 2018, where awareness of the ocean plastic pollution crisis has risen, et cetera, people are generally more aware of what they are throwing away. They think about it a little bit more. If they can put something in the recycling bin rather than the garbage bin, they want to. So I think good garbage is what we notice. And I am seeing more and more people start to think about like, oh, when I got this shipment, it came with like all this other packaging stuff I didn't really need. And they're noticing it. Good garbage is the garbage that we notice. My longer term answer is like, good garbage is the garbage that we don't have at all, obviously. But I think that we're in this really hyper aware state right now. And a lot of companies are needing to be very cognizant of the packaging that they are sending to consumers' doorsteps, because people are starting to notice it more. So even though for a long time good garbage has meant the garbage that we don't see, I think now we're kind of at this point where like good garbage, if we're going to really move in a direction of a circular economy for packaging, is the garbage that we're generating awareness of.
That's definitely a first, so thank you for that.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, nobody said, garbage that we can see, because that is what is going to result in more change. So that's really cool. So thank you so much, Caroline. This has been such a delightful and a very learning conversation for me in many ways than you may not realize, because just simple nuggets that you've provided here and there in terms of just application or reduction in packaging or investing in new ideas are all just so enthralling to see. So good on the work that you guys are doing as Atlantic Packaging, Wes and the team there. And of course, I think it's such a good thing that you managed to join this team, because I'm sure you're going to create big differences as time passes. So thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for sharing, your clear ecological spirit and your heart towards this planet. And thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad that it was helpful, and I am always excited to share the work that we're doing. Like, we definitely don't do this alone. So I'm excited to see what other packaging companies and innovators are doing us. And as I mentioned before, if anyone out there is working on innovations in packaging that they think we should be aware of, please find us. The easiest way to find me is on LinkedIn, and anyone can shoot me a message.